Well, I just remember as a young Christian finding Van Til's book in a bookstore, and this is after many years actually of reading a lot on apologetics, and I picked up a volume by Van Til. It was absolutely excruciating reading for a young Christian, but I plowed through the defense of the faith. This was, over 20 years ago now. But, Van Til supplied something to my Christian worldview that I really couldn't get anywhere else in terms of just the impossibility of the contrary, antithesis, all of those things. And I'm so grateful for Van Til as a theologian. But today I want to talk about Van Til somewhat with respect to being a theologian that is somewhat neglected, and how we can benefit from him. And so back with us again is Dr. Lane G. Tipton from the Reformed Forum. Brother Lane, welcome back to the show. Brother, thank you for joining me again.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It's an unqualified delight.
Amen, brother. Well, let's just jump right in as we continue to talk about Lane's book, The Trinitarian Theology of Cornelius Van Til. Maybe on a biographical note, Lane, why don't we talk a little bit about Van Til himself? Why do you think Van Til, in the academic world, is somewhat neglected and misunderstood? I've heard you mention that a couple of times. Why do you think that is? Is he too simple? Is he too biblical? Is he too reformed? What do you think has happened there to his career in scholarship?
Well, that's a really good question. It's a fairly complex one on one level, but I'll say this by way of orientation. I think that Van Til has been so neglected recently, or so rejected recently, due in large part to some of the failures that derive from second-generation Van Tilians. And I'll give you just a couple of brief examples. I think that when John Frame wrote his book, Van Til, An Analysis of His Thought, I think many people took Frame to be immediate, because that was published in about 1994, right as Greg Bahnsen passed away. Frame publishes this volume, and it sends Frame into a kind of ascendancy as an interpreter of Van Til. And what happened around the same time, and I'm going to say somewhere around 1995, this is all from memory, Frame wrote an article entitled Something Close to Biblicism. And when you talk, Biblicism is the doctrine of reflecting on biblical teaching in a way that is not in conformity to the ecumenical creeds and the Reformed confessions. That's just how that's the most basic way to talk about Biblicism. It's me and my Bible, and I'm not going to read it informed by ecumenical creeds and Reformed confessions. And Richard Muller wrote a response to that, didn't like it. Frame wasn't advocating for Biblicism in the way I just defined it. It was something close, but that sets people off. Reformed Christians are not biblicists. They're not something close to biblicists. They're creedal and they're confessional, and they have a very well-established identity. Well, a few years later, Frame publishes No Other God. A few years after that, in the late mid-90s, a few years after that, his Doctrine of God. And on page 502, which I cite in my book, he says that God has two modes of existence. On the one side, he has an eternal mode of existence when he's not related to creation. On the other side, he has an historical mode of existence. And when he relates to creation, he becomes temporal. He has a temporal identity, two modes of existence. This isn't the two natures of Jesus Christ. This is two modes of divine existence in creation. Well, brother, let me just say that. This is a fair observation. I think many people take Frame's Biblicism, or something close to it, Frame's mutualism, his denial of God's unqualified immutability, and they say, if that is Van Til, then for those two main reasons, Biblicism and mutualism, I don't want anything to do with it. If you fast forward it, well, I wouldn't say fast forward too much, but beginning in 2003 up until around 2018, another prominent second generation Van Til scholar, Scott Oliphint, began promoting the thesis that God changes when he sovereignly wills to know creation. If you go back and look at God with Us in some of the other books, Oliphint isn't arguing exactly the same thesis that Frame is arguing. Frame says the creation is the time point at which God changes. For Oliphint, if you go back and read Westminster, to try to hide it, pulped the great majority of his books and didn't want them to be distributed once they found out how bad the error was. But if you have a copy and you can locate one, he locates the change in God as contingent upon God's will. When God knows the world, what he calls free knowledge, Oliphint says it's there that God sovereignly generates what Oliphint defines as a covenantal mind characterized by progress, development, and ignorance. He says God doesn't know where Adam was hiding in the Garden of Eden. He says God doesn't know if Abraham believed him, Genesis 3, Genesis 22. And so for Oliphint, you have in the free knowledge of God the generation of a covenantal mind that is developmental, inferential, and ignorant, so that it can truly interact with creatures. It is an ignorant, developing, covenantal mind. And I think Oliphint probably did more harm than Frame and pushed Van Til into greater obscurity and derision. Here's why. Frame at least admits in the Van Til volume from 94, Van Til, an Analysis of His Thought, he at least admits, I'm not a Van Tilian, but his friendliest critic. He says that. He's explicit. So you can make the argument with Frame, well, okay, look, he's not a Van Tilian. He says that. He's just his friendliest critic. The compounding problem with Oliphint in his published writings, and I've never seen him recant or retract this idea of the will of God being the instrument by which this mutable covenantal mind was formed. He says God's nature doesn't change, but he's always said that. But what makes the second generation offense of Oliphint, I think, higher than Frame's is that in his published writings, he claims he is a Van Tilian, and in the foreword to Van Til's Common Grace in the Gospel, he attributes his error, his mutualism, his biblicist, mutualist, ignorant God, the ignorant covenantal mind, he attributes that to Van Til. And so in the case of Oliphint, you have someone claiming to be a Van Tilian and denying the architectonic distinction that defines Van Til's system, which is an unqualified, immutable, triune creator. He's immutable in his necessary knowledge. He's immutable in his free knowledge. He's immutable in his decree. He's immutable in creation. He's immutable in incarnation. He's immutable in consummation. And for Oliphint, he is immutable essentially, but the moment that free will, that will of God actualizes free knowledge, which Oliphint will then call covenantal knowledge, a covenantal mind, there is this dialectic of essentially immutable, covenantally mutable, essentially impassible, covenantally passible, essentially simple, covenantally composite. And it's a dialectic that if you keep pushing it back, it will become Bardian. But it's not, because he doesn't actualize the incarnation. So when you ask me that question, and I don't do this in this book, this is a separate volume that I'll get to in another 2 or 3 years. If you ask the question, why is Van Til so programmatically misunderstood? Well, apart from the criticisms of Gershner and Sproul and the Du Bois, the second generation Van Tilians, particularly the work of Frame, and then I think intensively the work of Oliphint, have driven people who want to be creedal, who want to be reformed, who don't want to be biblicists, who don't want to be mutualists, who want to affirm the classical reformed doctrine of God. They don't want to touch Van Til because they think that Van Til is the cause of these novel, I think I call them neoteric in the volume, these neoteric departures from creedal and reformed theology, much less the teaching of Scripture. So, Emilio, I think that I only have one footnote for Frame and one footnote for Oliphint. I didn't want to distract people in this volume.
Yep.
But if you tell the rest of the story, which I just kind of did, and you primary source it, you can go from at least 2003 to 2018 on Oliphint, and from at least the mid-90s up through 2000s with Frame, and you can chart this sad, even tragic denial of Van Til's theology, either in the name of being a Van Til critic, like Frame does, or in the name of being a Van Tilian, which Oliphint does. And I think that is one of the main reasons you've seen such an acceleration of the rejection of Van Til. When Bahnsen was the expositor, before he died in 95, Van Til was making a comeback. But when Bahnsen passes and these mutualists step in and biblicists step in, it is like pouring kerosene on embers that then ignites into a flame, and it's driven people, I think, away from Van Til because they fear there's an organic connection. What I tried to show in the volume, there's no such organic connection between Van Til and Frame and Oliphint when it comes to the most central distinction Van Til makes between the creator and the creature in relation.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic that both Frame and Oliphint make the same mutualist error, maybe from a different approach. And if there's one thing that you get from Van Til, is that he's going directly against correlativism and mutualism, which is just incredible.
At every point. I'll give you one last quick illustration. When we do the Van Til group, Carlton Wynn, Camden Busey, and I do the Van Til group. We've worked through the defense of the faith. I think we're like third chapter. I don't know. I don't remember exactly where we are. But here's the irony. Doctrine of God, Van Til, is explicit in denying correlativism. Doctrine of man, explicit in denying correlativism. Christ, church, last things. In the opening chapter, in every section, Van Til is reminding us that at no point does God take new qualities or properties to himself, characterized by change over time. At no point does he will a new mode of existence. He's so explicit on that. And that's what, I won't call it maddening, but that's what's so disappointing about those who, at least in the name of Van Til, wanting to expound him and follow him loosely like Frame or staunchly like Oliphint, not only to disagree with him, but to deny his most basic premise, which is robust anti-correlativism at every point. It's a tragic irony.
Yeah, no, it is. And now you mentioned Bahnsen. I just want to add one layer of complication there, because I always regarded Bahnsen as the most accurate of the proponents and the students of Van Til. But recently, I've had a couple friends tell me, that one of the reasons that they kind of shy away from Van Til is they think that Van Til is some sort of necessary or some sort of corollary to the error of theonomy. And so they're afraid that the antithesis and neutrality and things like that is going to lead necessarily to some sort of a theonomic view of the world. And I'm trying to tell them, no, in fact, no, not if you understand the Vossian background of Van Til. You're not going to make that. You're not going to make that error. You want to just speak just a little bit to that?
Sure. Oh, sure. Before there was Bahnsen, there was Gerhardus Voss. And Gerhardus Voss was a professor at Old Princeton, and Van Til, along with one other student, was often one of only two students in the classes that Voss taught, because he was not a popular professor. Stunningly. And there are a number of reasons for that. Danny Olinger brings them out in his book, Gerhardus Voss. But Van Til inherited from Voss the doctrine of natural religious fellowship, where Adam was wholly inclined toward God in religious worship. And then Voss, in his Reformed Dogmatics and elsewhere, says that in original sin, there's not just a loss of original righteousness that was superadded. That's the Roman Catholic view. So that the good nature is weakened or diminished in some way. And instead, Van Til, following Voss and the Reformed tradition, said man is entirely inclined now against God. That being wholly inclined toward God before the fall now means by nature you're wholly inclined against him. Not as bad as you can be, but at every point you're opposed to God in thought, in word, in deed, in reason, in will, and affection. The whole person is at enmity with God. Now, that is a fundamental entailment of creation and sin. That is robust Augustinian Calvinism, and that's where Van Til roots the antithesis. He does not go on and say the antithesis is between those who affirm the typico-symbolic civil law of the theocracy as a norm and blueprint for social justice versus those who don't. That's Bahnsen. Bahnsen is taking the typico-symbolic laws, the judicial laws that the Confession says, 1904, are expired, and making them a universal, rigid blueprint for socioeconomic justice, binding all magistrates in all ages until Jesus returns. Van Til never affirmed that view. Van Til followed Voss, seeing the theocracy as an intrusion of the ideal kingdom, the heavenly kingdom. He did not follow, did not endorse, did not encourage the theonomic views of Greg Bahnsen. And when he found out certain things about Rushdoony, he distanced himself more and more. We've got letters from Van Til to that effect. So here's what I'd say. Van Til is not a theonomist. Theonomy didn't even exist when he was being trained. Van Til is a Vossian. Voss is an amillennialist. He is not postmill. Voss is a covenant theologian, and he is Van Til's following Voss's covenant theology, Voss's amillennialism, and so I think that there's a when it comes to situating Van Til's relation to Bahnsen, I think what Bahnsen did is he grabbed the antithesis from Van Til without grabbing Voss behind that. And then he made formulations that would stand against Voss, against Klein and others. So I put it this way. As far as Bahnsen goes as an apologist and as an expounder of Van Til when it comes to method, distinguishing him from evidentialism, distinguishing him from a blockhouse method, distinguishing him from other methodological approaches, Bahnsen stands head and shoulders above the other second-generation Van Tilians. There's no comparison. Vastly superior. In fact, I've even got, I won't read it, in 1994, he wrote a confession for a church, and he articulates a doctrine of immutability that is priceless and precious. It's unbelievable. It knows nothing of the mutualism of Frame, Oliphint, and these second-generation types who departed from Van Til. But when it comes to Bahnsen as a theologian of redemptive history, he did not develop as he should have, partly because he had already, while he was at Westmont College, I don't know how many people know this, but when he was at Westmont College, he had already written the lion's share of theonomy and Christian ethics, which he took as a THM thesis at Westminster. And so it kept him, I think, in part, from actually listening to Gaffin, actually appropriating Ritterboss and Klein, and actually letting the theologians that Van Til admired the most, Voss and Klein, impact him. Van Til would say that Voss was his favorite professor and favorite theologian, and I've seen a copy in the archives in the OPC. Van Til gives to Meredith Klein in 1969 a copy of the Christian Theory of Knowledge, and do you know what he calls Klein? The Prince of Exegetes. Meredith Klein. Wow. And what does Bahnsen do just 10 years later? He writes missives and invectives against the Prince of Exegetes, according to Van Til. So if you and then of course Klein reciprocates and dedicates the structure of biblical authority to Van Til, the what? Prince of Apologists. And so
that's great.
Yeah, so people need to.
No, that's great.
Yeah, if you get into the weeds, get in a little history, and get beyond what Klein called Bahnsen's overheated typewriter, and stuff. If you get beyond that, and no one, listen, I'm telling you, you'll meet no one who has more respect. I trained under Bahnsen. I took all the courses that he had to offer, read everything that he wrote, have great admiration for him as an apologist and philosopher and an expounder of Van Til's method, but he just missed basic formation that Van Til got from Voss and did not share the deep admiration and appreciation Van Til had for Klein. That's the way that I'm putting it to, a lot of young Calvinists today that are getting kind of caught up in the theonomic errors, I see it, is that they've gone to the right of Van Til instead of to the left. They should have went back to not only Van Til's contemporaries, but obviously to Voss and Bavinck and the Reformed tradition. So appreciate Klein as much as Van Til did, and then you'll get the theocracy. That's right. Then you'll understand common grace. Right. Then you'll understand nominalism, and you'll have a wonderful, robust critique of post-millennial theonomy and Christian Reconstruction. Doesn't mean you let go of the antithesis. It just means you define it in a more robustly Vossian way. No, that's really good, and I think it's it's needful. It's because we're not trying to go on a theonomic tangent so much, but I think it is important to kind of situate Van Til in the greater kind of environment in which this discussion is going to result in anyway. Bahnsen is inevitable, and so I think it's important to discuss that. Let's turn a little bit here in our discussion, Lane, going back to your book, and just talking about what I think is so absolutely important to the premise of your whole thesis, which is Van Til's notion of the self-contained God. I want to really give you time to develop this, to expound on the self-contained God, to explain how this informs Van Til's notion of the God-world relation, and also to maybe even touch on how does the self-contained God regulate Van Til's apologetic. Yeah, well, those are wonderful questions. I begin with a discussion in the I guess you could call it the first chapter proper. I think it's chapter 2, entitled "The Immutable Triune Creator," the deeper Protestant conception of the creator-creature relation. And what I try to do, not to talk about the whole book, but to just give a snippet, so that a cross section, so that people can hear and get a feel for what I'm doing in that book. Van Til says that the triune God is self-contained. Now, a lot of people don't see that language in Calvin or Turretin or Bavinck. It is in Bavinck some, by the way. But they see that and say, I don't know what that means. What does that mean? That sounds a little weird. Why does he speak that way? Well, self-contained, if you can think of it, think of self-contained as a circle, okay? And in that circle, you place the traditional attribute set that you find outlined in the Shorter Catechism 4. What is God? Well, as self-contained, he is infinite. He's a spirit, infinite, eternal, and unchangeable in his being, wisdom, power, wholeness, justice, goodness, and truth. He is simple, not composite. He's impassible, cannot be acted upon, does not react, is not changed or determined by the creature. All of those attributes, pour them into that circle, and that's what Van Til means by self-contained. Now, most people would say, oh yeah, that's really basic, and doesn't Oliphint, don't all Van Tilians say that? Well, here's the rub, here's the key. Van Til affirmed that God is self-contained when we think of the creator-creature distinction. That is, when God's not related to the creature, he is simple, he is immutable, he's impassible, he is not determined by anything outside of himself, he's a se. Van Til affirmed that, but here's an irony. Karl Barth, theoretically, abstractly, could affirm that. Dorner, theoretically, abstractly could affirm that. Schleiermacher, theoretically, abstractly could affirm that. Here's, and so of course, so can biblicists. I think open theists might have a little bit of a problem with that, but as long as God isn't related to the creature and needing to know libertarian free agents, there's a sense in which that can be affirmed. Dipolar theists, process theists can affirm that abstractly about God. Here's what Van Til says, though, that's so key. God is not only self-contained apart from his relation to creation, but he remains self-contained in the relation. God does not add a new mode of existence that's historical, temporal, like frame. God does not generate new composite properties like ignorance and mutability and passibility in order to relate to creation. God remains self-contained in his new relation to creation. He doesn't change when he knows the world outside of himself in free knowledge. He doesn't change when he decrees. He doesn't change when he creates. He doesn't change when he forms Adam from the dust of the ground as the image of God. He doesn't change when he reveals to him the special terms of the covenant. The person of the Son does not change in the event of the incarnation. God remains self-contained apart from and in his sovereignly willed relation to creation. And Emilio, one way to summarize it, and this is what separates Van Til from the second generation group I mentioned earlier. It's what separates him from all forms of process theism, all forms of neo-orthodoxy, just any form of correlativism or mutualism. Van Til, and this is my way of summarizing it, Van Til maintains the creator-creature distinction in the creator-creature relation. God isn't self-limited or self-modified. He doesn't mutate or change in that relation. And when you get that, it's beautiful, because self-contained means he is infinite, eternal, and unchangeable, simple and impassible apart from creation, infinite, eternal, and unchangeable, simple, and impassible in relation to creation. Immutable apart from and immutable in relation to creation. That's what Van Til means by self-contained. Once you understand that, do you see what a beautiful summary term it is? That's why I use it. That's why Van Til used it, and that's why I would never shy away from using it. It's a wonderfully helpful catch-all phrase to affirm the immutable glory of the triune God apart from and in relation to creation. And so I titled that second chapter, the first major chapter, I title it The Immutable Triune Creator. And if I were to change that title at all, I might change it to The Self-Contained, because self-contained says more than just immutable. It includes immutable, but affirms more. It affirms everything that we want to say about God's attributes in a helpful catch-all way. So I love it, and I hope our readers, hope your listeners,
now, do you think that the language of a self-contained God also informs Van Til's understanding of knowledge? In other words, how God comes to basically be what Van Til later calls, God interpreted facts, no brute facts, those kinds of ideas. Somewhere in the Defense of the Faith, Van Til talks about God knowing himself by one eternal act of vision. And so how does the knowledge of God relate to the self-contained God?
Yes. Well, there's a great. Let me give you. I've been reading Turretin a lot, because Danny Olinger has pointed out that Voss was very dependent on Turretin's institutes of elenctic theology, and so there's a very strong mediation of Turretin through Voss that Van Til imbibed. And I'm not going to read it, but when Turretin talks about the knowledge of God, before he makes a distinction between the free knowledge of God, and the necessary knowledge of God, and the free knowledge of God. God knowing himself on the one side, God knowing all things possible and actual outside of himself on the other side. Turretin says that when we talk about the knowledge of God and the quote unquote intellect of God, he says that that mode consists in the knowing of all things perfectly, undividedly, distinctly, and immutably. It is distinguished from human and angelic knowledge perfectly because he knows all things by himself or by his essence, not from abstracted things as with creatures. Undividedly because he knows all things intuitively and noetically, not discursively like creatures. Distinctly, not that by a diverse conception he collects diverse predicates of things, but because he most distinctively sees through all things at once. That's the vision, the knowledge of vision Van Til's talking about. So that nothing, the most minute, can escape him, and immutably, because with him there is no shadow of change, as he himself remaining immovable gives motion to all, so he sees the various turns and changes of things by an immutable cognition. Now, brother, that summary there by Turretin implies the simple and undivided and immutable character of God's knowledge. And one of the things that Van Til makes so clear, and what earlier I said was denied by one of the second generation Van Tilians, namely Oliphint, Van Til is going to tell us this, that God has one mode of knowledge that corresponds to his one mode of being. That his knowledge is immutable, undivided, and simple. It does not make progressions through time. He knows where Adam is. He knows if Abraham trusts in him. He knows all things by an eternal act of intuition and has a vision of the whole when it comes to his free knowledge. And that stands over against all forms of mutualism, because I'll put it this way. Hard mutualism says God changes in his being. That's direct. Soft or indirect mutualism says, well, God might not change in his being, Oliphint's essential attributes, but he changes in his knowledge. Free knowledge changes, develops over time. It's discursive, developmental. He has an ignorant, developing covenantal mind. Van Til, following Turretin, following Bavinck, following Voss, ascribes simple, immutable, exhaustive knowledge of all things to God's mind. So before you make any distinctions between necessary and free knowledge, that's in place. And once that's in place, it is impossible to say, well, maybe God's being doesn't change, but his knowledge does.
If you can, what was the reference to Turretin again? Where was that found? If you can find that again.
By Van Til at every point. Oh, if you want it, it's in the 12th question, the knowledge of God, 12th question, knowledge of God, and it's Roman numeral 2. 12th question, the knowledge of God, Roman numeral 2, and it's from Institutes. Let me see if I can get the page number for you. Look it up. It is from just for your listeners, it is from Volume 1 of the Institutes, page 207. Volume 1, page 207, 12th topic, knowledge of God, Roman numeral 2.
Yeah, I'm a stickler for citations, so thank you so much for that.
Absolutely, brother. And that
it's
citation,
got to be profitable, right?
It's got to be profitable. And Van Til, he says, just to clue listeners in so they'll see this. When Van Til talks about this, he says, this is his language. He says the being and knowledge of God are coterminous. That's what he means. When he says the being and knowledge of God are coterminous, he means that God knows all things perfectly, undividedly, distinctly, and immutably, distinguished from creatures, because he does not gain knowledge or develop understanding through time. All things are given immediately by an immutable, simple, and exhaustive cognition.
No, that's great. That's really great. Let's come back to the issue of mutualism, because I think that for a lot of people, as I'm reading different people writing on the doctrine of God, mutualism is kind of downplayed at times as a threat. That it's overblown, that no one actually is holding to divine mutualism. But even at the practical level, even at the practical theology level, practical Reformed authors, I quoted a couple to you last time you and I were together here in Texas, where basically God is so hyper personalized and hyper relatable that he goes beyond the anthropomorphic and he enters into what can only be called mutualism. So how serious, therefore, is the threat of mutualism, and how detrimental or how determinative is that for your program of theology?
Yeah. Well, I want to just tip a hat to a dear friend of mine, James Dolezal, who has written a book, All That Is in God. And he does a fantastic, admirable job at alerting us to the fact that mutualism is much more prominent than we think. He doesn't say it at every point, but I think that's because kind of a biblicism is much more prominent than we think. And I'll tell you, let me try to be practical. I always view myself as being practical, but let me try especially hard to be practical here. Herman Bavinck talks in his Reformed Dogmatics. I don't have in my mind right where this is, and I won't read a quotation, but he says that the doctrine of immutability is of the utmost religious importance. And what he means by that, Emilio, is this: that when we're talking about this doctrine of a finite God, or he has a covenantal mind that develops over time and is ignorant so that he can be really interactive with us. Just get right there and interact with us with an ignorant developing mind. That kind of theology, a lot of people say, well, look, what practical difference does it make? Practically speaking, what difference does it make? And Bavinck has a couple of points on that. Voss does something similar, but Bavinck says the first problem with it, when you're talking about it, it gives you no religious hope. And here's why. If God covenantally, in his mind, this developing ignorant covenant mind, if he doesn't know the future, as he is your God in time, if your God in time, in covenant, does not know the future, doesn't know where Adam and Eve are hiding, doesn't know if Abraham believes him, doesn't know the future, you cannot have any assurance that his promises are faithful and true. So let me put it this way. The issue is not just one of theological heterodoxy. The issue is a religious failure. A doctrine of a mutable composite developmental God fails people religiously. The Father does not change as he gives every good and perfect gift. And if his works don't change, his promises don't change. But if he does change when he works, if he does change when he promises, we have a huge crisis. And so let me put it this way, Emilio. The practical value of this, the religious value of this, is that if God is living and immutable and does not change, when he promises something, it is the greatest certainty on which you can pin your existence and future hopes. But if he changes, if he's mutable, if he's ignorant, if he's developing, you really have no hope. And tender consciences, minds that are reflective, will be terrified and plagued and tormented by immutable God. So here's the irony. I think Clark Pennock and the Open Theists, I think others, Karl Barth, the second generation Van Tillings I've talked about, I think they're trying to be practical, trying to give you a God who is relatable, trying to give you something of religious value. In fact, I've heard one of those, I won't tell you who, say that his view of the mutability of God as condescended is of great religious value to him. Well, the real point is that it destroys true religion as defined in the scriptures and summarized in the creeds and confessions. And so this really is of just enormous practical and religious value to affirm an unqualified doctrine, a doctrine of unqualified immutability. There is no hope without it.
Yeah, no, that's really good. In your book, you also, when you develop just all of the, all of the theology of the processions, when you get into autotheon and all of the, just everything relating to the persons and subsistence and all of that, I saw tremendous agreement between you and Brandon Ellis. Brandon Ellis's book on Calvin and aseity, the aseity of the Son, particularly when we're talking about subordinationistic views. With subordinationism, how is Calvin's doctrine of aseity, perichoresis, the self-contained God, how is that protecting us in Reformed theology from all these different species, both ancient and contemporary, of subordinationism?
Yeah, well, let me just put it this way, and this is counterintuitive for many, but in the volume, I cite where Van Til, in explicit dependence on Warfield, notes that Calvin's doctrine of the Son as autotheos, the autothean conception of personhood, is an attempt to safeguard the doctrine of homoousios, that the Son is of the same substance as the Father. And autotheos, as developed by Calvin, was an attempt to safeguard that ancient Catholic affirmation of homoousios. And the way that works is in this way. The Son, if the Son has his essence of himself, and the Father has his essence of himself, you have such a robust and clear mechanism in place, instrument in place, to express full-orbed homoousios, the same substance. Neither is communicated, neither is derived, both have essence of self. Both are personally and permanently in the Godhead. Both personally are ase. And Calvin was concerned, I think, and Ellis is very helpful here. I cite him and just say that I think his work has, if possible, it may have superseded Warfield's work in terms of the scope and the clarity he achieved. And that's saying something. That's quite a compliment to Ellis for his work. But if you don't affirm autotheos, then it's easier, Calvin thought, to slip into some notion that in the quote-unquote donation of the essence, the Son's deity is somehow derived because communicated. That's what Calvin's trying to safeguard. Now, there may be people who hold to a different view of the processions who say, but that's not what happens. And perhaps it's not. But Calvin's concern is to reform the theology of the processional relations of personal origin in order to safeguard and maximize the clarity of the Church's confession of the Son as homoousios. And he thought that autotheos did that because it avoids the idea of a communicated essence which could trend in the direction of a derived essence or a derived deity. And so I think that Calvin is probably least appreciated today for that insight. And it strikes me as concerning when people want to call themselves Calvinists. They talk about God's sovereignty, they talk about total depravity, they talk about irresistible grace, they talk about limited atonement. They should begin with autotheos. That is perhaps, as Warfield says, and Van Til follows, one of his most ingenious and helpful contributions that aids in our critique of a Catholicizing direction that we mentioned earlier.
I guess I would follow that up, Lane, by asking you a response that I've heard in return has to do with the communication of essence or essential communication, but somehow within the essence. I know you've heard of this, and then I want to ask you about Warfield's rejection of eternal generation. And so let's just start first with sort of an intra-essential communication. And what's wrong with that proposal?
Well, I'm not sure if you have a particular person in view, I could deal with that a little more readily, but just to talk broadly, when we're talking about the communication of essence in the standard discussions of medieval and Reformed Trinitarian theology, you're talking about a relation that is notional, or a relation that is personal, the relation between the Father and the Son. And the communication of person and the communication of essence are conjoined. There is a communication both of essence and person in the generative act of God. If you start to back away from that processional relation of personal origin and talk about an intra-essential communication, it starts to sound like a communication of essence without any kind of personal processional relation in place. At least to me. Now, we could put specific formulations, specific quotations up and deal with it. But I think what Calvin was wanting to say is that, and I believe Ellis deals with this at a few points in his volume. I think what Calvin was wanting to say is we're talking about a processional relation of personal origin, and in that processional relation, Calvin wanted to affirm a communication of person and not a communication of essence. Now, one essay that we could talk about, maybe you could have him on one of these days, one essay that I have read that tried to challenge that on Calvin was written by Benji Swinburneson. It was published in K-Works. He's a dear friend of mine, tremendous theologian, great Vossian, great Van Tilian. And he took a view that would not comport with the view of Ellis in his book on Calvin. Ellis, that Calvin might have some notion of a communication of the essence along the lines you're suggesting, but I think when we look at Ellis's work, we look at Warfield's work, and we look at Van Til, regardless of that debate, Van Til is following what you might call the received tradition at Princeton of Calvin's view of autotheos, especially in the work of Warfield. It's and to be honest with you, on the issue of Warfield and the discussion of whether he denied or affirmed eternal generation, that might be something for almost an episode in itself. I'd need to look at the best scholarship on that and assess those arguments and then try to address them in light of those particular arguments. So I'm not sure I want to jump in on that particular issue without looking back
Yeah.
at some of the debates that are around that. I don't want to speak to it without missing some of the nuances in that narrow discussion.
Sure. And I just think coming back to Van Til as we come close to our time here, it's all of these ontological issues in the essential Trinity, that all of these things are to buttress, I mean, you correct me if I'm wrong, but all of these things are to buttress this notion of a self-contained God that is foundational to all of our, to our worldview, I guess we could say. And so I think that's the way that Van Til is incorporating all these issues.
Yeah. Whatever else we say about autothean personhood, is it serves anti-correlativism, anti-subordinationism, and a Trinitarian theology that serves a reformed doctrine of image and covenant. That deserves all the emphasis we can give it. Whatever else Van Til's doing, he wants a Trinitarian theology that underwrites not the Roman Catholic conceptions of nature and grace, but that directly underwrites the Reformed conceptions of image and covenant. Not image and donum, but image and covenant. And that, I think that is that's a good guide. So that Van Til didn't address some of these other issues in the interpretation of Calvin. What he did is he took that insight as it was inherited through Warfield, and he applied it to a doctrine of image and covenant, and formed what, I know we will probably wind up talking about this down the road, formed a thoroughgoing integration of classical Reformed Trinitarianism and classical Reformed federalism in opposition to all forms of correlativism, ancient, medieval, and modern. And so that's kind of a good guideline as you're thinking about autotheos. What's it serving?
Yeah.
Anti-correlativism, anti-subordinationism, and it's grounding a reformed theology of image and covenant. That's the key.
Amen. So rich. Brother, so rich. Thank you so much, Lane. Brother, thank you so much for taking so much time and for joining us so far for these episodes. These are absolutely, brother, these are essential. These are important. This is, there's quite a few people that are obviously looking for this kind of content and I know they're going to benefit from this. Maybe next time in our next episode, we can touch on absolute personality and the absolute personal condition of the covenant between God and man and all of those things. But Brother Lane, thank you so much. Thanks for joining us. Another episode of Christ and Kingdom. Everybody, thank you so much for listening. Make sure and share, subscribe, and enjoy. God bless you all.